Hey everybody, here he is, Max the Wonder Dog. This is Max. He's a mutt. I think he's about 8 years old now, and he's a very good furry dog. That's his one appearance of the quarter, unless he gets a call for an encore later on in the quarter. But he's saying hi. He's saying welcome to the class. Hope you're all hanging in there and having a good time now, given the circumstances. And he's in quarantine too, so he feels you. He knows what you're going through. Anyway, okay. Let me put him away, and I will be right back. All right, there we go. Hopefully you can hear me okay. It looks like there's a lot of feedback on Max. He's going to be so happy. Let's take a look here. Uh, yeah, that's a good boy. He is a good boy. Yes, somebody asked about the dogs in the background. They are cloned. Thank you for asking, Roya. Alicia wants me to hand him over now. That sounds a little threatening. I don't think he wants to leave. He seems very happy here. Anyone else? Yeah. Kialani, that is a very fluffy doggy. You are absolutely correct. Encore, please, every day. You know, he's an easygoing dog, but every day picking him up and having him in front of the lights like this could be a little tough. But yeah, thank you. Maybe he can come back. I'm sure a lot of you have cute dogs too. He is single. If any of your dogs are interested. Yeah. Okay. And then there was one question Marvin asked in the very beginning, not about Max, and that is, Professor, was last class's lecture uploaded? I was present but wanted to rewatch it and take notes on key points. Yes, I believe it absolutely is uploaded. You should have access to it. You might want to refresh your browser on YouTube if you can't see it, but I upload it typically within a couple of hours after. It takes a little while for it to be processed through YouTube, and Zoom has to process it too and everything. So it takes a couple hours, but they should always be up later that night. So I would suggest refreshing if there's any problems, I'll let you know. Okay, anything else? A lot of comments on that. Oh, you have Stephanie has a 9-year-old dog named Ruby. Yeah. Oh, Jalen asks, what breed does he get? I think he's just a mutt. I think he's like, looks like a little schnauzer, maybe a little poodle. He doesn't shed, so maybe that's a poodle thing I've heard. Yeah. And he's one of the healthiest dogs I've ever had, certainly. Mutts tend to be more healthy, probably, many of you know. Okay, I'm glad everyone had such fun with Max, and I will now close the chat so it's just to me. And okay, I hope you guys are hanging in there. I know this is not what you thought college would be, but we're trying to do the best with it. I know my own son is, he's kind of quarantined to his room almost, and his dorm room. He's actually living on campus. And, he's not having the sort of social life that he was kind of hoping to have in college. But I really think this time next year, certainly, if not sooner, that's all going to change and things will be back to normal. And I think we're going to feel better, hopefully, after I won't tip my hat here, but hopefully after early November, we'll all feel like we're on the road to recovery, if you know what I mean. Okay, let's go ahead and share the screen and start today's lecture. Just to remind you, by the way, for those of you that have missed the beginnings of class for whatever reason, do know that they are recorded, and in the beginnings of the class, I do talk about what the course requirements are. At least I did in the first two lectures. I won't bother doing that anymore since it would be repetitive with what you already have access to. Okay, but if you've looked at it and you still have questions, ask me during our next break, and I'd be happy to answer the questions, and I certainly will be talking about the exams as we come closer to that time. Okay, then let's go ahead and get into today's lecture. So let's remind ourselves of what we've done so far. Remember, the big story in this class is that we all have perceptual skills that we are unaware of having, that our brain is always doing perceptual feats that we aren't quite aware of. And some of these skills can be improved. In fact, I would say a majority of them can be improved. And you saw a great example of this when you learned about Daniel Kish and his buddy Brian Bushway, and learned that they could use echolocation as their main means of getting around. And then you learned a little bit about what the informational support was. You learned a little bit about how an expert echolocator is distinct from you in terms of the brain regions they use and that type of thing. And then, of course, you did learn from your discussion section that, in fact, with a little practice, you're able to echolocate too, which is probably something you never knew before. If you had a chance to really experience that, terrific. If not, you might want to play with it a little bit and have your friends do it. Your young siblings, they'll do anything you tell them to. All right. Anyway, what we left with, though, is the question about the sound source. And the question we asked is, how important is using your own sound source to echolocate? And certainly, Daniel Kish would not be making click sounds with his mouth if it didn't help him in some way. But Daniel will tell you, as will many people who are expert echolocators, that it does help to make your own sound because you can control it, how loud it is. It's what we call timbre. It's kind of, whether it's a low bassy sound or a high clicky sound, that sort of thing. But they will tell you that you don't have to use your own sound to echolocate. And in a way, and this is where we're going towards today, we are actually using reflected sound all the time. Okay? Not to bike ride, certainly, not to guide hikes, okay? But when we first go into a new room, when we come into a new environment, I'm going to argue, based on what you'll be learning today, that we are actually using sound reflections from a room to get a sense of the type of room we're in. And we start talking about at least initial evidence of that in terms of the old echolocation research back in the 1950s. So, they discovered this really amazing thing. My gosh, this is based on sound, and bats and dolphins are not the only mammals that do that. We do it too, and we can be taught to do it better. They tested everything that they could think of at that point to look into it. They didn't do brain scans back then, of course, but they looked at the type of sound, and that's what we're interested in now. They found that people could, in fact, echolocate using sounds other than ones they made themselves. So they could echolocate if a sound was coming out of a loudspeaker that was kind of, connected to their shoulder, that was making the sound. They weren't making any other sounds. They didn't have hard-soled shoes on, anything like that. And then they found that if you suspend a loudspeaker just in the middle of the pathway, above the pathway around the middle, you could play things like noises and tones and clicks towards the wall, and people would still be able to echolocate. So here's very clear evidence that it doesn't need to be your own sound, okay? Just like Daniel suggests, right? And then we talked about something that almost seems impossible, and that is the idea that there can be just very, very quiet sounds in a room. Remember, we demonstrated this by trying to be quiet for a second. It's so hard for a neurotic New York Jewish guy like me to be quiet for longer than a few seconds. I'm just telling you that. I have to talk all the time. Okay, anyway, by being quiet, we can sometimes hear the quiet sounds in a room. I'm going to try my best. Yeah, I hear ventilation in my garage a little bit. I hear, maybe leaves rustling outside the window here. Very, very quiet sounds. And believe it or not, those sounds are sufficient for reflected sound to come from the different surfaces of our room. I'm in a garage. I'm giving that away. Not with the doggies, unfortunately. And then we left off right at the end starting to talk about a series of experiments with blind children who were, shown to be pretty good echolocators in general. And they were asked to do something really interesting. They were just, brought to I guess, a psychology building or something like that. This was in the 1980s, I believe this research took place. They were told to take off their shoes and make no sound at all. They did this one by one. And instead, they were just supposed to listen and try to feel where different obstacles were. And what they did is they took some panels, like I guess maybe panels made out of very hard cardboard or maybe even wood or something like that, that were just 4 inches in diameter. I'm sorry, 4 feet in diameter. The panels were 4 feet in diameter. And asked them, so 4 feet in each, I guess 4 feet is more like this, right? In each direction, and asked them to walk towards those panels and determine their location. Now, there was no sound in the hallway. They were wearing socks. They were making no noise. They were told to be as quiet as possible. But there was some of that quiet, ambient ventilation type sound. Very, very quiet. Remember, we talked about how that can be kind of exaggerated if we do this. But, I mean, even, it's nearly silent, silent room pretty much. But the blind children could detect sound reflecting panels, and even, as it turns out, sound reflecting strips of cardboard that were just 6 inches wide. So, sorry about that. Yeah. They were able to detect the presence of 4 by 4 foot panels and 6-inch cardboard strips that were kind of placed along the wall. They were told, okay, follow these strips if you can experience them being there, if you can perceive them being there, and make sure you don't bump into them. And in fact, these children could do it. It was just amazing. They could do other things too, again, just based on the quiet ambient sounds of the hallway, the corridors they were in. They could determine whether they were at an intersection between the corridors of a building, on a floor of a building. Again, just by using the reflections from the walls at the corridors with the ambient sound. And then finally, they could easily use the walls and the reflections of the walls as guidance for walking. Okay, in other words, they were told, okay, get as close to the side wall as you can, okay, and walk along that wall without bumping into it. And they had no problem determining where they were relative to the wall and being steady in their pathway. Suggesting that you need, echolocation, yes, can be better with your own sound, but you can do echolocation with other sounds, even other sounds that are functionally silent in a way, right? Very few of us would say the quiet rooms of ventilation were much sound at all, but that's enough to fill the space, for the ventilation sounds to fill the space and provide reflections that then a blind child can use to guide their pathway around panels, cardboard strips, corridors, and even walking down straight along a wall without veering off one way or the other. So here's what I think you need to do about echolocation. And this is kind of a transition into another aspect of reflected sound that I alluded to before. That echolocation kind of is a nice way to start thinking about sound reflections, because it's kind of, you got to demonstrate it yourself. You could click or make some sort of sound and walk to the wall and realize you could stop before you got there. It is a really nice way to have an intuition about echolocation, and it's a very nice way to be very precise about your echolocation. And if you want to do a mountain bike ride, guide your mountain bike riding with echolocation. Clicking is great for that. But perceiving reflected sounds is more than that. Perceiving reflected sounds doesn't require you to make a sound at all, as you've just learned. And, typically when we come into a new room, as I said, we can have a sense of the size of the room and the surfaces in the room just by the noise that's coming, that exists in that room already without your sound. So this idea of using sound reflections, kind of like we're submarines, or sending out sonar, or even bats, which are kind of considered sonar-driven animals, although I think bats are a little more complicated too, is limiting. And I say this in the book, and I'm saying it now, that there is a limitation of the sonar metaphor, that thinking about how we use reflected sound as sonar, where it's required that we make our own sound and then wait for the reflections of our own sound to come back to us, is limited. And what do I mean by that? That is just one extreme and, kind of very, exciting example of how we use reflected sound. But we're using reflected sound all the time without us necessarily making any sounds at all. And I think a better metaphor, what I mean by a sonar metaphor is this: most of the time we're not using reflected sounds like we're a boat with a sonar mechanism or a submarine with a sonar mechanism. Okay, that's kind of what I mean by the metaphor here. Okay, most of the time we're using reflected sound, it is not involving our own initiation of the sound. And what I think is a better metaphor is what I'll call, I made this up, just because I like to put this word in the book, spelunker. Do you know what a spelunker is? I knew about it because when I was a kid at camp, we used to do spelunking. Spelunking is just kind of a funny name for, it is in the dictionary, but it's kind of a funny name for exploring a cave. So if you're a spelunker, you're a person who explores caves. And the reason I like to talk about that is when you go into a cave, that's not a fancy pants cave with lighting and all that sort of stuff, but a cave that's not readily explored. You have a flashlight, as do all your friends that are in the cave too. So I went in with my bunkmates when I was a kid, and we go into these caves, and we'd all have flashlights. And we go, oh, this is so cool, and we do all the fun cave things. But of course, we'd all use our flashlights to determine what was in the cave. And yes, when I used my little Rosenblum flashlight to determine what was in the cave, I was able to kind of direct that light and say, oh my gosh, there's something like a stalagmite there. There's something like a boulder here. Oh, looks like there's a corridor down here that goes to another part of the cave. I could do that with my flashlight, but I could also use the reflections of everybody else's flashlight that was down there, right? And that's really, really important because I don't require the reflections of my own light to be able to perceive this space. Okay, it helps. It allows me to be more maybe it's a little more informative in many cases, but I can use everybody else's reflections from their little flashlights as well. And I think that's how we have to think about sound reflections. And it is even the case that those reflections, when it comes to sound, can be very, very quiet. So the idea here is moving from the Daniel Kish sort of very active, very precise echolocation to talk about something that the brain does kind of more generally than that. And that is the fact that we can hear what I'm calling ambient acoustics. We hear sounds from things that don't make sound. Right? That's very clear with the Daniel Kish case, with the active echolocation, but it's also the case for us all the time. Sound sources, whether they're quiet fan noises or ventilation noises, or somebody else is talking next to you, is filling this space, and it is informing you. It's telling you not just that somebody next to you is talking, it's telling you something that somebody next to you is talking in a room that has certain dimensions with, walls in it versus carpeting and all that sort of thing. So that's what I mean by hearing ambient acoustics. And no one knows this better than the folks who work on movies and TV. They are dealing with this all the time. And this was one of the most exciting sets of interviews I did when I was writing the book. I live in Los Angeles, which was very convenient when it comes to talking to people who work on movies and TV. And I asked them these are sound engineers, how do you have to compensate for what you believe the brain is doing in listening to movies, in listening to TV? I mean, how can you address this sort of thing so that you can basically not only trick the eye into believing to some degree that there's something real visibly going on, but to trick the ear into believing that there's something audibly going on. So, you're recreating a space for the listener. And they had some great answers. First of all, one thing they said, so you think about this next section is kind of hearing lessons from Hollywood. We're going to learn a lot about our brains and how our brains hear from Hollywood. When you talk to these guys, and I think I write about two or three of these guys, but I talked to probably 4 or 5 of them, and they all pretty much said the same thing, that their job as sound engineers is not just to create kind of clear sound, whether it's dialogue or sound effects or something like that. Their job is to keep the audience in the scene. That's something they said over and over again, and they all meant the exact same thing by it. What they meant is, especially if you're listening on a good sound system, whether it's in the theater, remember movie theaters? Oh, I hope they come back. Or at home, listening over a surround, 5 speaker system, or maybe with headphones. Maybe you folks do a lot of TV viewing on your computer or your iPad or even on your phone with your earbuds on or whatever. They're aware of that. And what they're trying to do is make the listener feel like they are part of the scene that they are seeing, that the scene acoustically is happening around them. And maybe you've noticed this before, especially in theaters, right, where there's speakers everywhere, if they're nice surround sound theaters, that sometimes, it sounds like things are behind you. Sometimes it sounds like things are on the side of you, as if you're in the middle of the action yourself. Of course, intellectually you're not. The screen is up there. Even with 3D films, you can separate yourself from the screen, but to make you feel more like you're part of the scene that's actually being depicted, that you're in the scene that's being depicted, they are very, very careful to recreate a sound space, okay, to make you feel like you're in there. Okay? So what they want is the theater or your home sound system or even the headsets you're wearing to make it seem like it's an extension of the scene space. I listen, my wife sometimes goes to sleep earlier than me, and I like to watch a little TV before I go to sleep. So I listen to a lot of TV with headphones on. I've got one of those remote things. I don't know if you folks have these at home, but they're great. So you just watch TV and you have these nice headphones on. And if you listen that way, you really get a sense of how much care goes into this. They really try to get you to feel like you're in there with the characters that you're watching. And it makes it seem more visceral almost. I don't know if you've noticed the difference between watching TV where there's a small little loudspeaker at the TV versus putting headphones on versus being in the theater or versus being in a surround sound system. But there's something more engaging, more visceral, if in fact you can listen to sound that makes it sound like the action is happening around you. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. But what they'll say is that they have to do it well and they can't have lapses. They can't make mistakes. And, they say that the audience sometimes doesn't know this, but if they kind of find themselves spacing out a little bit or kind of feeling a little less engaged with the scene, it's often because there's some sort of glitch in the scene. There's some sort of mistake that was made. And they'll say that, if there's all of a sudden it doesn't sound like the dialogue is coming from the room that you're seeing, the audience might be distracted. And you might think of that distraction as, oh, well, I guess maybe I'm not that into the story, or maybe I'm thinking of something I'm going to be doing later. But they really believe this, that when you are distracted from especially seeing a film in a theater, it's their fault. They feel like they haven't done something right with sound. Their goal is to keep you engaged, to keep you attentive in the movie as much as possible. And any deviation from that can throw you out. And all these guys said the same thing. I was thinking, maybe they're kind of trying to, kind of show how good they are to each other, but they felt very strongly. And you might know how much, money and care goes into sounds of movies. I mean, sometimes the budgets of the sound, I think, to the Star Wars films, I think the budget is ridiculously high, and actually, kind of is comparable in some ways to the budget that goes into the visuals. They take all this stuff very, very, very seriously. And let's say any glitch can take the audience out. Now, in the old days when cell phones first became popular, you're lucky you avoided this, but people were just so kind of unconscious, and they'd leave their cell phones on in the movie theater, and they answer them in the movie theater. They thought, well, it's got to be so important, and it was just such a bother. I remember having to always shush people, and then for a while, I don't know if you still see this, but for a while they'd have things that came on screen and say, make sure your cell phone is off. I don't know if they have to do that anymore. And also, this happened in classes back when cell phones first became popular. Everybody would go in with their cell phones on, and we'd get multiple rings in any one lecture session or something like that. People are better at this now, but that's a great example of being thrown out of the scene. Other examples of this. This is one of my favorite bad movies ever. Maybe some of you know this film. It's called Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's by a director called Ed Wood. And you may know that name from a movie that is a Johnny Depp movie. With what's his name? The guy that did the Batman movies. I can't remember the director, but he did a movie portraying Ed Wood's life as the worst director in history. And Ed Wood was known for this. Really funny, kind of exciting sort of director. But he loved making movies so much, he just wanted to kind of get through them and didn't care if there were glitches. So here's a scene from Plan 9 from Outer Space, and look at it for a second. You can see, first of all, the sets look ridiculously cheap, but look what's there. I mean, and Ed Wood would not have cared about this. In fact, this is a real still from the movie. Right up there is a shadow of the microphone that's recording the scene. Okay, that's the sort of thing that takes the audience out of the scene, and those things do not happen anymore. If they happen, they're completely by mistake, and people can get fired from missing that sort of stuff. So it's taken very seriously. But what we have to be concerned with, given what we're discussing, is how sound matches the scene, and you're going to see that's a lot of hard work for these folks. So if in fact, the soundtrack does not match what you're seeing on the screen, it makes you feel less engaged with the movie. Now, you might be experiencing these things now. I think, for a while, what we called dub movies, I think they still call them this. When I was a kid, for example, dub movies were foreign movies that were the soundtrack, the dialogue was substituted with an English speaker. So this is a movie, Godzilla, in Japanese, one of the old Godzilla movies in Japanese. And they would bring American English-speaking actors in to overdub the speech of the Japanese actors who are speaking in Japanese. And so, you'd see the person move their lips, and it would have no synchronization at all with what you were hearing. And that's the sort of thing where it can kind of take you out of the scene. Now, it's interesting. I've realized that with Netflix and Amazon Prime and all these, that you can watch almost any foreign film or foreign TV show with dubbed or subtitled language. And I can't watch the dubbed versions. I still get completely distracted. I feel like I'm less engaged in it. Oh God, what is that? What's that movie? Or that series, really fun series, Bank Heist. It's a really fun Spanish TV show. I think it's got 3 or 4 seasons, and it's very clever. But you can watch it with American English dubbed in it, or you can watch it with the subtitles. And I tried it first with the dubbing, and I couldn't do it. I just was so distracted. And that's exactly what these guys are talking about. Any sort of distraction takes you out of the scene. And here's a very clear case where the dialogue that you're seeing doesn't match the dialogue that you're hearing. Okay, so how are we doing with time here? Okay, I think this isn't a bad place to take our first break. So let me stop for a second. We'll talk more about this. You'll see it's really interesting how they solve this problem when it comes to reflected sound in just a second. But let me take a few questions from you folks, and then we'll go through our practice question. All Oh, these are all still doggy questions. Money Heist. Oh, it's not Bank Heist, it's Money Heist. Thank you so much. Have you guys seen it? Yeah, you like it? Yeah, my both my sons. Um, it was required watching for both of my sons for their Spanish classes, and they both ended up loving the series. They thought it was just terrific. Yeah, it is. It is Money Heist. Yeah, right. Yeah, the original title of it makes a lot more sense. It's La Casa de Papel. Bad Spanish, Rosenblum, but it's the House of Paper, I believe, which is much more kind of descriptive of what the story is about. Yeah, the professor. So Vanessa just wrote the professor is a genius, and I assume she's talking about me, or maybe the professor in the show. I don't know. All right. Anyway, also, can you re-explain the spelunker metaphor? Absolutely. Let me just do that very quickly. You can go back and watch it again. I don't mean to use a complicated word. Splunking is just cave exploring. That's it. That's all you need to know about that word. However, I like the idea that when you think about going into a cave and using not only the reflections, the illumination you see from your flashlight, but also being able to tell what's in there from other people's flashlights and its illumination, that's kind of a good way to think about sound reflection too. You're not only able to use your sound reflections, you're able to use other people's reflections as well. That's all it means. So sorry for the fancy word. Splunker is a good word. You can use Splunker. Use it 3 times and it's yours. All right. Does sound affect brain plasticity? Absolutely. Great question, Kangwei, and we will definitely talk about it. Other question? Oh, Vanessa wants to correct it. So she is talking about the professor in the show, but she also says I am also a genius, but I am unfortunately much less rich than that genius. Okay. Vanessa asks what time our class is. Yes, it is always 5 to 6:20. Hopefully you guys know that. What is brain plasticity necessarily, Vanessa? A different Vanessa asks, and that is the idea that our brains change based on experience. And we'll be talking about that in a lot of detail in a few weeks. You'll get that. You'll know more about brain plasticity than you'll ever want to know. So yes, we are learning about it now. And when we talk about expertise of all types, like we'll be talking about in a second, we are talking about brain plasticity, but we'll be talking about it very directly soon. Mia says something very nice. Thank you. Okay. Yes, we are going to learn about vision, Conway. Jalen asks, so with the Splunker metaphor, would this be the evolutionary difference between bats and human echolocation? Okay. You ask a great question. So is it the case that we are the only ones that use echolocation of other people's sound sources? And I believe the answer is no. I don't know. I know there's a little research on bats using other bats' echolocation. So, yesterday I was thinking of you guys. I was thinking of you folks outside. I was grilling some food out in the backyard. It was getting dark. And out come the bats. And they are so cool. There's like 3 or 4 of them. They're flying around. I get so excited to see them. And I bet as they're doing their little squeaking and trying to find flies and mosquitoes and staying away from tree branches and stuff, they are in fact using each other's sound reflections. It's not just their own. Their own really helps to be very precise about where the sound is going and how it's changed. But I bet you anything they're using other bats' reflections as well. That's terrific. And then Yunjai asks hold on a second, I'm having trouble seeing this. Oh, yes, brain plasticity is the same as neuroplasticity. Yeah, I just am trying to stay away from technical terms, although neural isn't that technical. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Thanks for the great questions. Let's do a poll question. And this is a question, again, that will be in your test. Oh, this one's going to be so easy. It is right based on the slide you had before this one, so you're going to get it really easily. Let me read the question off, then I'll post it, give you a minute, and then we'll talk about it. Again, this is a question on your slide. Echolocation can be performed using 1, mouth clicks, 2, sounds played through a loudspeaker, C, the quiet ambient sounds in a room, or D, or 4, all of the above. Okay, here goes the poll. I'll give you a minute, and then we'll talk about the answer. You're doing very well. All right, about another 15 seconds, and then we'll go through the answer. You all did so well. I don't think many of you need the reasoning here, but it's worth it. Okay, let's end it here, and I will share the results. And as you can see, 97% of you chose the last answer, all of the above, and that is in fact the correct answer. Okay, so a few of you chose mouth clicks, and that's partly the correct answer, but it's not the best answer because it's also true that not only can mouth clicks be used for echolocating, but sounds played through a loudspeaker, those kind of positioned next to you, sounds hanging from the ceiling, a loudspeaker hanging from the ceiling, all those can be used as echolocation. And then the quiet ambient sounds in a room can also be used to perceive, reflectances. So, in a sense, that's echolocation as well. So the correct answer here is in fact all of the above. It is one of the answers. It is one of these questions where all of the above is the correct answer, not some sort of trick question or something like that. Okay, so if you haven't taken a picture of this yet, go ahead and take a picture and know that most people got the correct answer, 97%, and great. Terrific. Let me see if there's any other questions just very quickly. It is absolutely an exam question, Roya. Yunja, hopefully I'll remember Yunja, that Jaden is the name you'd like to be called, no problem. I understand that some animals have done this, but in what ways, if any, can you describe a time that humans have had such intense echolocation that it paired with visuals as well? Echolocation that gives a visual of the sounds received, I think you're writing there. I understand that some of the animals have already done this, but in which way can you describe a time that humans have had such an intense that it... okay, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, Janai, but I think the examples I'm going to give from the entertainment industry, from Hollywood, sound engineers will help with this. I think what's important to know is that everything I'm about to talk about is not typically something we have conscious awareness of. Remember, that was the same with Daniel Kish's sort of echolocation. We are hearing sound reflectances, and we are rarely aware of that skill. And that's hopefully when you say describe a time when humans have such intense echolocation, rarely do we have intense echolocation to the point where we are aware of echolocation. I don't think the brain necessarily works like that, but we are using reflectances all the time, is what I'm arguing. Is hearing ambient sound? So Aya asks, is hearing ambient sounds the same as hearing silent objects? And it's just kind of, when I say hearing silent objects, I'm saying that we are hearing things that don't make sound, and that is absolutely the case in all the echolocation examples we gave you. A wall that you're walking to does not make sound itself. It reflects sounds, and that is in fact the idea of hearing our space, our hearing, ambient sound space, basically. So yes, they are pretty much the same thing. When I say you're hearing ambient sounds, you're hearing things that are reflecting sounds as well as making sounds. Great, thank you very much. These are all such good questions. I'm very impressed. You guys are really listening carefully and thinking hard. Good for you. All right, back to Godzilla. So, let's talk about kind of the most direct example that's related to us. And the idea is this, and this was really, really fun to learn from these folks. I had a sense that this was the case based on research that occurred in the field, but I really was so happy to see that silly scientists aren't the only ones that think of this, and people who, do work in such kind of artistic ways also think of this. They know, these sound engineers, that we are really good at hearing how rooms structure sound, even though we're not necessarily aware of this. Now, I can make you kind of feel a little bit more aware of this. The book does this too. You know that if you have a big closet, or like a closet that you can fit into, that when you go into the closet, it sounds very different in there than if you go into your shower or your bathroom. And the differences are obvious, right? When you go in your closet, there's so many soft things in there, your clothes, things that are hanging from the hangers, whether they're jackets or shirts or pants or all that sort of stuff. Those are soft surfaces. And what soft surfaces do is they absorb the sound, so it sounds kind of quiet and I guess maybe dampened in there, versus going into your bathroom, your shower, a locker room, where there is so much sound reflection from the hard surfaces, right? From the hard surfaces of those rooms. And so you probably, if you think about how a closet sounds versus how a bathroom sounds, there is an intuition for you, okay? That might be where you've noticed that sort of thing before. But your brain is so much better than just being able to determine that difference. For example, this is I think, just miraculous. Oops. Okay. When these folks are working on movie sets or TV show sets, they have to make sure that the space that is heard is, I guess, compatible with the space that is seen. What do I mean by that? Okay, so I'm showing you there, it may be a little hard to see, but I'm showing you there a set for a TV show. And I think it's supposed to be, there's a bed in there, I believe. It's supposed to be a bedroom, or maybe just a piece of a bedroom, so they could do their filming in there. And so they do their filming in there, and it's a bedroom, so it's not going to be a very large room, probably. The average bedroom isn't, if you think about your bedroom, it's pretty small. And so it's going to have certain sound characteristics. However, when a scene like this is filmed, it's sometimes, or very often these days, filmed on a sound stage, which looks like this. Okay? And look at the difference. Now, the camera doesn't show that, right? The camera is not panning around and showing you this is not really a bedroom. This is a bedroom on a giant sound stage. Okay. By the way, I'm not sure why it's called a sound stage. There might be some history to that, but I'm just talking about this giant, stage that this little tiny room is going to be filmed in. Okay. Think about this. If you were to start talking, maybe clapping your hands in this cavernous space, it would sound really echoey, wouldn't it? It's you, just like if you've ever been in a large warehouse or an airplane hangar, or any sort of large enclosed space that doesn't have a lot of debris in it or anything like that. It sounds echoey. It really does. It sounds like it's in a large space. But the sound engineer's job is to make all the recording of the dialogue, any sort of sounds that occur in that bedroom set, make it sound like it's like this. And so what has to happen is they have to make some compensating. They have to do some compensating of the sound space so it matches the visual space. Okay? So the problem is, very, very often in TV shows, very often in movies, the visibly depicted scene is not the same as the natural acoustics, the natural sound of this huge place. Okay? Yes, they do a lot of filming on location, so that's not as much of a problem there, but actually, I'll tell you why it continues to be. But they do still a lot of filming, especially with TV shows and series and a lot of interior of movies that have a lot of interior shots. They will film in a space like this. Okay? They have to make that space sound different. And so the acoustic space they're in has to be modified. How do they do that? Well, if you're looking right there at that little image, you're probably anticipating where I'm going with this. So I'm going to introduce you to somebody called Jay Patterson. And if you've read ahead in the book, you've already met him, but you'll meet him tonight or this weekend when you read about him. Jay Patterson officially is called a sound mixer. It's not the best title for what he really has to do, but that's his official title. I would never ask you, what's the difference between a sound mixer and a Foley artist or anything like that. I just want to make sure I respect his profession. And it's actually, it's not bad for you to think about this the next time you hear, the Emmys or the Oscars giving out awards to sound mixers. And they do this all the time. Jay has won an Emmy, for example. You'll remember what he does exactly. So I talked to Jay. We went out for coffee and we talked about his profession and he gave me a little demonstration. It was just wonderful. These guys love talking about what they do. Typically they're the guys that are behind the scenes where everyone wants to talk to the stars of the show, the movies that they're working on. And for anybody to show interest in what they do, which is actually really interesting, they just love talking about it. It's usually the case that I have to leave and they want to continue talking in these interviews. What Jay said was something I think just very, very straightforward. He says, every space in nature, every space in man-made buildings, any space has an acoustic signature. And our brains are aware of that signature. Okay, so whether you're now in your living room or your bedroom or maybe in your kitchen, that space sounds different than the other rooms in your house. And importantly, it sounds different because you might hear, running water if you're in the kitchen, but that's not really what he's talking about, and it's not what I'm talking about. What he's saying is it's the reflected sound of every room is different. And think about a closet versus a bathroom. Clearly, each of those have a very distinct sound signature. And it's not the sounds that necessarily, again, are being made in these rooms. It's how the sounds are being reflected in these rooms. So this is what Jay has to contend with. And he gave me, kind of like the typical, kind of setup for one of his jobs. He's done, I actually, all the shows and movies I know that he's worked on are probably before your time, but you could look him up. He's still working. He's not that old a guy. I'd be very curious to see what he's working on now. He goes into a set. So, he's working on a TV show. He goes into a set as they are kind of, making sure it's decorated right. All the props are around, and then the cameras are situated in the set. Say it's an office space, okay? He has to go in there while all the setup is going on. And he has to figure out a way to make it sound like it has the reflections of an office space, okay? Yeah, there's going to be typewriters and stuff, but he's not really interested in what's making sound. He's interested in what's reflecting sound. And typically, like that image, that slide you just saw, the office will be regular, maybe small office size, but on a sound stage, that's humongous. And so he has to go in and figure out very quickly how to shape that space and its sound reflections so it matches what the viewer will be seeing in the TV show. Here's how he does it. He walks into the room and he looks around and does a single hand clap. And usually that's all it takes. Maybe, he'll later on check it again, have, one of the folks that works for him kind of do it in different positions, but that's it, okay? And based on the single clap, he'll know what needs to be done to that room so it sounds like it looks. So it sounds like it has the size as is being depicted visually in the show. How does he do this? How does he change it? Well, imagine again that giant soundstage. He has to quiet down those echoes. He wants the reflections of this space to sound like the way the space that you're going to see in the TV show or movie. So what he does is he brings in things to change the space. He brings in blankets that look like this. He showed me some pictures, and he's got hundreds of blankets they have out in trucks. So if you ever see, if you're ever, in LA and you see them setting up for a shoot or something like that, almost every time I've seen them doing this in the neighborhoods around here, you can see people bringing out these blankets. And I always thought that they were either for the actors to rest on or they're covering for props or something. They are not. They are there and have been designed specifically to change the reflected sound in rooms. Okay. He uses baffles too, and baffles are, in that previous image, you saw some wooden walls, and some of those wooden walls were what you call a baffle. It's not important, the difference. But what he has to do is bring enough in and critically position them in the right place so the room that you're hearing sounds like the room that you're seeing. And then to make sure that he's capturing the kind of modified acoustics, the modified sound of that room, he'll place multiple microphones all around that space. So you probably know that actors, we'll be talking about microphones in just a second and how they are used to capture actors' speech. But these days, to capture actors' speech, they use lapel mics, tiny little lapel mics. And they apply them in different ways. I don't know if anyone saw the video version of Hamilton, but they actually had mics in their wigs that were miking their voice, tiny little mics in their wigs, and sometimes you can see them hanging down. But these days they are typically hidden. And there's other types of mics that are very critical that are suspended from the ceiling, like that Plan 9 from Outer Space example you saw. That gets the dialogue. But what Jay needs to do is get the sounds of the voices as they reflect from these surfaces. So he takes little microphones and puts them all over the floor of the set and on the walls of the set. And what happens as the actors speak to each other, they're not just being recorded from the microphones that are connected to them or kind of hanging from the ceiling that can swing back and forth to get their dialogue. They are also being recorded, importantly, from all these little microphones all over the set. And those microphones capture how sounds are changed by the sound reflections of the space that he has helped shape. Okay? It's a very clever way of doing it. I think it's a very, very cool thing. And it takes time. I mean, I think he said depending on the show, he has anywhere between 6 and 20 people working for him. And they're in there with all these little microphones and they have to stay away from the cameras and they have to make sure where they hang the blankets isn't where the camera is going to be pointed and isn't, kind of covering an important part of the props or anything like that. He says it is that right there is the most stressful part of his job, is to set up the acoustics correctly in a relatively short amount of time. But he does it great. He does it absolutely great. And he's won awards, as I said. I'll look it up. I'll look to see what he's done recently. I think when I interviewed him, and he was in his 50s, so I imagine he's still working, and he's one of the most, successful sound mixers in Hollywood. So a really interesting guy to talk to. Okay, I'd like to continue with this and have you meet somebody else. I'm going to have you meet a guy called Sandy Berman. And Sandy does something that is really based on the recordings that someone like Jay would give him. He is what you call a sound designer. Now, this might be a term you've heard. So you've maybe have heard in the Emmys or Oscars, people getting awards for best sound design, that sort of thing. You've probably heard that term before. This is what Sandy does. This Sandy is another award winner. I think he's won an Emmy as well. But what he does is he takes the recordings that someone like Jay has made and then adds two things. Okay? He adds sound effects. And sometimes those are obvious. If it's one of these Marvel things, one of these aren't Marvel movies, that they have to add a lot of sound effects to get those great superhero sounds. But he also does something called looping. And I'll tell you what those are those things are. By the way, another term for sound effects maybe you've heard is Foley arts. It was just basically it's a name that's named after one of the first people to ever do this in film. Like after film started to become talkies, after they had sound on film, one of the first people to kind of pioneer the techniques, the sound effects techniques, was a guy called Foley. I think Jim Foley or something like that. And it's just sound effects. It's not just the laser sounds in the in the science fiction movies, or the car sounds in the Fast and Furious movies or anything like that. It also sometimes is very simple things like the recordings that were done on location didn't really capture footsteps very well as the characters were, say, walking through rooms or hallways. Their footsteps just didn't come out very clear. He takes those recordings and adds footstep sounds to those recordings. Okay, looping, on the other hand, is just I know these all these fancy names. It's nothing more than when they have to bring the actors back in to redub their dialogue. Okay, this happens on every movie. It happens on most TV shows, not with soap operas. They don't typically worry about that then. But almost every movie and TV show that you're watching has some redubbing by the original actors. Why is it called looping? Simple reason. They bring in the actor onto kind of a big sound studio. There's a giant screen there, and what they show on the screen is a short clip of the actor. Okay, the actor's watching himself, saying the line that needs to be dubbed, and they'll do it over and over again. Okay, so say I'm George Clooney, and I do get confused with him sometimes. I go into the sound studio and say, George, you did a great job, but we had a tiny bit, pretend Jay Patterson had a tiny little problem recording this dialogue here. Can you re-say it so we can put it in and it will sound very clear in the movie? So I look at the screen, and there's my face saying a line, having a line reading. And as George Clooney, I listen over headphones to the line reading, and then I say it myself into a microphone. And basically what they do is they then take that re-recorded dialogue and add it to the movie so it becomes clearer for the audience to ultimately hear. That's looping, and Sandy does that a lot. And that's actually a lot of time has to go into that. But here's the problem. Sandy is also concerned with, like Jay, the issue of reflected sound. Because, okay, say that when George Clooney was originally filming that scene, he was in a bedroom. Okay, that means that after Jay kind of constructed the bedroom to sound like a bedroom, the original recording should sound like his voice in a bedroom. But now here I am, George Clooney again. This is fun. George Clooney again coming to the studio, and this studio has the acoustics that are nothing like a bedroom, right? Most of these studios, are big spaces as well. Okay, so how does Sandy Berman get the redubbed George Clooney to sound like the original George Clooney who was recorded in a bedroom? Okay. And here's the different ways he does it. They spend so much time. And they also do this with Foley, too. They have to make sure that when they do a sound effect of, say, footsteps, it sounds not just like footsteps, but footsteps in an office, footsteps going down the street, footsteps in a locker room or something like that, right? Same thing, whether it's Foley or looping. But let's talk about looping since it's, I think, intuitive for us. How do they do it? Sandy says there's a lot of ways, and the way he will do it depends somewhat on the budget he's given for this, because he believes that some techniques to recapture or to simulate the reflected sound of the room being depicted are more effective than others. The first one, maybe I'm not sure if you guys would have learned this anywhere, but it's a technique called room tone recording. And this is how it works. I can't remember. There's a scene from an old movie where they keep on having, it's a comedy. They keep on having trouble. They're filming a movie and they keep having trouble doing the room tone recordings. I'll see if I can find it for you. It's very, very funny because this is how it works. after George Clooney, and who's in the movie with George Clooney? Sandra Bullock. Is there one with both of them? I don't know. Imagine there. Oh no, Julia Roberts. Okay, there you go. It's one of the Ocean's 11 movies or something like that. Okay, so we're in a bedroom and we're talking. George just doesn't. The line reading isn't clear, but now they have to redo. His line reading, so they somehow have to figure out how to get his line reading to sound like it was done in the original room. So let's bring it back to the original room. Here we are, George Clooney and Julia Roberts are talking in this bedroom, a hotel room. And after we do our scene, if the director says, that's perfect, cut, let's go to the next one. Right before they leave, get this, right before they leave, an engineer like Jay Patterson will come up onto the set and say, wait, nobody move. We need to do room tone recordings. And this is what he does. He takes a specially designed microphone that often looks like the one you see here with, kind of 4 separate mics that are kind of connected to a tree-looking thing. And he will put it in the middle of the room and say, nobody move and nobody make a sound. So here I am, George Clooney, the famous and important George Clooney. I have to sit there or stand here for a minute, a whole 60 seconds, as does Julia Roberts, while the recording engineer is taking a recording of a quiet room. Get this. So it is a quiet room. He wants it as quiet as possible. You know now that no room is really completely quiet because there's little sounds of ventilation, fans, that sort of thing. That's what they are recording. They're recording the quiet sounds. And get this, they're recording the quiet sounds in a space that is structured by the set that Jay Patterson had to come in and take care of, as well as having the sound structured in the same way as when the actors were in their positions. That's how important they think reflected sound is. That, I'm a big-time actor, George Clooney. I should be able to go back to my trailer now and do what George Clooney does when he's not acting on a set. But I can't. They want to make sure they get the room tone sound of that space with me and Julia in the same locations we were in when we were being recorded for our dialogue. They then take that recording, that very quiet recording, quiet but specialized recording, and when they redub back in the studio, they add that recording to the sound of the redub dialogue. And that is a very common way. In fact, it used to be the most common way of doing it. However, it's not the only way. In fact, if you ask Sandy, he'll say, yeah, it's okay. It's good for TV sometimes, for maybe, inexpensive TV. But no, these days we like to do it a little bit better than this. So him and some other folks came up with this idea to actually do something that he called worldizing, which I think is kind of a clever title. And he gave me the example of, I always have trouble remembering this movie. This is where, for those of you that are Jennifer Lopez fans, maybe you know this better than me, where it is Jennifer Lopez and Mark Anthony, where they met, they used to be married. They met on the set of this movie. I think it's El Cantato or something like that. I don't remember its exact name. Sandy worked on that movie. If you guys are Jennifer Lopez fans and you know all of her work, or Mark Anthony fans, maybe you know this sort of thing. I don't know. But here's the deal. He was working on this movie, and there was this, wedding scene where they went to Mexico, I believe, to get married, and the reception was out on this beautiful patio in Mexico somewhere. Just he said it was beautiful, adobe kind of style and hard kind of tiles everywhere. And they did it down there, and they recorded the dialogue between them and everything. And they brought those recordings back along with the film and everything. And Sandy realized that he had to have Jennifer Lopez come in and say a few lines over again. So they had her do it. They had her come in and do the looping, and she said her lines over again. And they thought, well, let's see if the room tone recordings will work. Because they did room tone down there. And he said, no, it didn't, because that space was so unique acoustically that when they added the room tone to her voice, it didn't sound well. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like she was saying those lines in the space you were seeing visually in the film. So what they did is they took the recordings of her voice that were redubbed in the studio and went back to Mexico. I asked him, I said, you guys just did this because you wanted to go back to Mexico and have a great time. He was like, no, we had to go in and out. We weren't able to stay. It wasn't fun at all. It was just all work. They took the recordings and put loudspeakers around that patio location, that beautiful patio location. And then what they did is they played her redubbed lines into the space and recorded those lines there. They recorded she didn't have to go down there, but her recording did go down there, which they played into the space through loudspeakers, and they had a microphone there, and they used that recording of her lines, again, literally in that space, to capture it. Now, what I'm trying to impress on you is you're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe the amount of waste that goes into these sort of films. They really believe that if they don't get this right, you're not going to be engaged to the degree you should be, that you're not going to be in the scene like you should be. That's how much effort's put into this. And it's all based on them capturing the reflected sound of these rooms. So cool. There is two other examples I want to give, two other techniques. And he said worldizing is actually his second. But back when I was talking, and this might be better now, there was an electronic way to do the same type of thing. So they didn't use this for the Jennifer Lopez film, but they then started using it a little bit after that film. What you can do is you can actually measure the space and take photos of the surfaces of that space. So imagine we're talking about this beautiful, kind of patio location. They actually could measure all the length and width of the space. They can measure the height of the walls, the outdoor walls that were surrounding it. And then they take pictures, and using the pictures, they try to guess what the materials are of that space. So say it's ceramic tile for the floor, it's stucco for the walls, all that sort of stuff. And then based on all that information, they put all this into a computer, and the computer then can modify sounds that come into it so it sounds like it's in that space. That's what convolution is. It's just a computer technique to try to recreate an acoustic space. So then the dialogue will sound more real again. So they would have Jennifer Lopez come in, she would say the dialogue, they would then take those recordings, put them through this specialized program on the computer, and hopefully it would sound like she was in fact speaking in the space that was being simulated based on the measurements they had done. Okay. That is also all that detail. Sandy said, it works well, maybe it will work better in the future, but I am not satisfied with that. Okay. What I want to do, said Sandy Berman, is to bring the actor back into the studio and have them speak the line in a recreated set. Actually take baffles, take blankets, take surfaces that are made of the same materials, and have them do it in that space. This is what he prefers to do. So let's go back to George Clooney talking in an office. No, bedroom. We were in a hotel room with Julia Roberts. I have to come back in as George Clooney. I'm saying my line, but rather than just recording it in the studio, he is going to surround me by baffles, by like kind of small versions of walls and materials that were in the original film space. And now I'm going to re-say my lines. And when he believes when you then record the actor in a space that is acoustically very much like the original space, that is the most compelling way to capture reflected sound. Okay, so he said it to me. He said, there's just when it comes to these things, there's just nothing like the real thing. You bring in these reflectors, you bring in baffles, you bring in blankets, and you try to get that sound as close as possible to the sound that was recorded during the original filming. This is just amazing, and it I think really speaks to the fact that the human brain is so sensitive to sound reflections that this is what these folks need to do to fool your auditory system into thinking that these people, and to some degree you, are in the space you're seeing. If it's not good enough, they say, especially these days, he says people are such good listeners, they hear things through such good sound systems, they have to make sure they are really reproducing the reflected sounds of a room so people hear the room they're seeing. Okay, good place to take a little break, and we'll come back to this slide in just a second, but let's see what questions we have first, and then we'll give you a question. Oh my gosh, so many fun questions. Okay. Would people, okay, Alondra asks, would people's voices echo while on scene? Oh, that's a great question. So, great question. I should have probably mentioned this. So imagine, let's go back to the small little scene in the bedroom, and then I showed the giant stage that this was actually done on. When Jay Patterson comes in there and puts the blankets around the set, in fact, for the most part, he is letting the actors hear what a small room would sound like. I mean, it doesn't only affect the sounds that are being recorded, it does affect the sounds that the actors are hearing too. It's a very, very good question. Okay. How would sound directors, Ariel asks, how would sound directors manage sound in, let's say, an animated show? Oh, that's a great question. I really wished, okay, so this was what, 10 years ago, 11 years ago when I did all these interviews. There were animated shows, but animation has really kind of taken a more important spot, I think, now in entertainment. So I didn't ask them about that, but it's a very good question. So do they spend as much time in, say, I don't know if you watch BoJack Horseman or anything like that, do they try to recreate this animated space as closely as they can with acoustics? That's a really good question. My guess is, to some degree, they would. If they're talking about spaces that are kind of more fantastical, as Ariel says, I don't know exactly how they do that. Maybe if it's I imagine that if it is supposed to be kind of a canyon-like visual depiction in an animation, they will try to do something to make it sound like those people are talking in a canyon. Yeah, that's a great question about animation. If I ever do a new edition to the book, I think I absolutely might look into that. It's a great question. Noah asks, what are some of the productions, JPEG? I'm going to have to look that up. Oh, okay. You're a fourth-year film major. Cool. So I'm older than the majority of the class. Okay. Well, I can tell you. He worked on a TV show called Without a Trace, which back when it was on, which was in the 2010, 2011, I think it was one of the most popular shows on TV. He worked on a movie called Citizen Ruth, which is kind of a satire. I don't know if you know those, but I'll have to go back and look. I'm very interested too. Can the blankets the blankets act like soundproof walls? Yes, they do. So then the sounds get absorbed instead of reflected. That's exactly right. It's pretty clear, as I said before. If you walk into a closet, the sounds from soft surfaces like the blankets Jay Patterson uses absorbs it, where hard surfaces will reflect sounds more. I can actually hear the difference. Can you? Hello, hello, testing, testing. Hello, hello, testing, testing. I can hear the difference. Even that little demonstration. I don't know if you could from listening to the microphone, but yes, you're absolutely right. It does absorb. Baffles can sometimes direct the sound, but blankets will absorb. Yes. Is the same procedure when it comes to filming animated movies? Great. I'm glad you asked this, Vanessa. We've already answered the animation. Is there a big difference in creating sound for live action versus animated? That's great. You guys are big animation fans. That was from Riona. Let's see. Justin asked an interesting question. Laugh tracks. Okay. I don't know what the status is of laugh tracks anymore. I grew up with laugh tracks on almost every comedy show. And what a laugh track was a recorded sound of a crowd laughing. And what they used to be able to do is, in these kind of film TV shows, MASH, maybe you guys have seen that, was a very popular old show. That was not done in front of a studio audience. And so what they had to do is they had to add laugh tracks to the comedy scenes. And you listen to it now, and it really doesn't sound like the actors are in the same space as the laughter. It is so conspicuously mismatched, which I think is a kind of an interesting example. Let me find a good old, a good example about this. It might not be the best sitcom in the world, but let me find an old example of this and see if maybe you can hear how the laugh tracks sound strange. Very good question. Kind of heard. Oh, you heard that? Cool, Roya. Is it the same procedure when it comes to filming animated movie? Animated, that's great. Do sound designers settings? Everyone asking about animation? Yes. If they have a movie in a place like space where the actors can't physically be, how do they recreate? You know something? This is a great question. And if you want a beautiful answer, go on the Warner Brothers studio tour. Their demonstration of Foley, of sound effects and sound in movies is of Gravity. Remember the Sandra Bullock movie in space? I think it's a terrific movie. The sound design and the thought that went into the sound design of that film is fascinating. So, sound doesn't travel in space, right? It needs air to travel. But what it does travel through is bodies. So they recorded sounds of things happening as if you were hearing it, like Sandra was hearing it, through the body. It is so, so interesting. Some like Star Wars movies, you hear the explosions when a ship explodes and stuff like that. You know that's probably not what it's like. But with a movie that really cares about capturing the reality of the situation, yeah, they put a lot of thought into it. Great questions, everybody. Okay, before the end of class, let's do a quick polling question, just so you have another one. And let's see. Yeah. Okay, this one's about the relationship between visual space and audible space, so the sort of thing that Jay Patterson would care about. And the question is this: the fact that movie audiences will be distracted if a scene's visible space does not match its audible space suggests, 1, every space has an acoustic signature, 2, humans are sensitive to how rooms structure sound, 3, the brain has a huge tolerance for mismatched vision and hearing, or 4, both 1 and 2 are correct. Okay, let's see how you do with this one. Okay, you're doing well again. This is absolutely an exam question. Every polling question that I put up is an exam question, always. I'm being too nice, but it's quarantine. Giving you a third of the exam questions. Okay, you need about another 15 seconds. We have to end class soon anyway. All right. Again, by the way, your answers are not being graded. I have no idea who's answering what, so don't be intimidated. Just take a guess if you want. It's no problem. I see some of you are a little hesitant to guess. Okay, here we go. I'm going to end the poll and let you know that most of you did very well. 88% of you got the correct answer. Yes, as Jay said, every space reflects sound, shapes sound in a different way. Every space has its own acoustic signature, as he called it. But that's all he means by this, and I think is just perfectly accurate. Sounds in a room that are reflected will depend on the surfaces of the room, where they're located, and their material. Also, humans are very, very sensitive to this. If not, you'll see some research evidence of this soon, but if it were not the case that people were sensitive to this, they wouldn't spend so much time and so much money trying to get the reflected sound correct in a recorded room. And three is wrong. The brain has a huge tolerance. No, it is not. Does not have a tolerance for mismatched vision and hearing. It is not tolerant of it at all. It is very picky. Your brain is very picky, so that the scene that you're seeing has to match the scene that you're hearing. It's not tolerant. It's picky. Okay, so the correct answer is both 1 and 2. All right, everybody, there you go. And I will see you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.